be here and delighted to be discussing corporate governance in private equity-backed companies. As some of you know, this is a topic I'm rather interested in. Many people would say I'm obsessed by it. But to me, private equity as a business model is mostly about governance. And I suspect we all agree that effective corporate governance can be an incredible force for good. A force for good in driving efficient, productive, innovative companies, certainly. And there is significant academic evidence that good corporate governance is a major source of value creation in private equity. But I also think good corporate governance can be, indeed often is, a force for good in driving responsible business practice, if you like, in helping companies to solve the problems of people and planet, to coin a phrase. And one of the things I try to do in my recent book is to explain why I believe that this is the case, specifically looking at the private equity business model. So what I'm going to do now is take a few minutes before we get to the panel discussion to explain why I think that good corporate governance does drive good decision making in private equity-backed companies, and why I think that in general that should lead to better outcomes for society at large, as well as for private equity's mainly institutional investors. I also want to touch on some current corporate governance law reform proposals, again, specifically in the context of private equity, including proposals to change Section 172 of the Companies Act, the core fiduciary duty of loyalty owed by a director of a UK company. And I want to explain why I'm skeptical about that proposal, indeed, why I think it could actually do more harm than good. On the other hand, I also want to mention some mandatory due diligence proposals and why I think they could be helpful, and why I think a greater focus on corporate reporting and on the idea of corporate purpose could also be helpful. So to start, as I say, I want to talk a little bit about the private equity business model and corporate governance within it. And the idea that corporate governance is a source of strength in private equity is of course not new. As many of you will know, a leading academic, Michael Jensen, wrote an article called The Eclipse of the Public Corporation as long ago as 1989. And in that article, he argued that private equity's business model would thrive because it solved some of the problems associated with widely held, often listed companies. Central to this idea was that private equity firms had managed to design corporate governance systems and incentive mechanisms that enabled the shareholders to be more confident that the day-to-day management of the company would be undertaken in their interests and not only in the interests of the managers. That problem, of course, a perennial one in the listed company world, where you have shareholders and managers who are separated from each other. But Jensen's thesis was very clearly focused on the idea that managers should be overseen by and accountable to shareholders. They should work in the shareholders' interests. And as he understood, private equity structures clearly facilitate that. Perhaps Jensen and other champions of the private equity business model took it for granted that more efficient, more profitable companies were not only what shareholders wanted, but that they were good for all of us, for a company's employees, for its customers, for its suppliers, for the tax authorities who tax their profits, for local communities, what are now often grouped together and called stakeholders. Or perhaps, like Milton Friedman, they thought it was up to business leaders to pursue profit and up to governments to set the rules of the game that would determine how that profit could be made. But today, of course, the idea that large businesses should only focus on making money is not popular. Indeed, we are much more acutely aware that efficient, profitable companies are not society's only objective. We are also focused on the negative impacts that companies can have on stakeholders when companies focus exclusively on shareholder value. We're of course all worried about negative externalities, about climate change, about human rights abuses in the value chain, about deforestation, about impacts on inequality, all of these things and more. But of course, these externalities are not new. Health and safety, anti-pollution, employment law, anti-corruption rules, these are all ways that politicians have in the past set the rules of the game for business. establishing the parameters within which they have to operate, no doubt at times restraining their single-minded pursuit of shareholder value. But discussion of these negative externalities is no longer focused only on these specific law reforms. They have also come to dominate the discourse about corporate governance law reform. And some people will say about time too. I'm afraid I'm not really one of them. Of course, I agree that corporate governance must be at the heart of any discussion about sustainability. If a company's decisions matter, then the process by which those decisions are made must also matter. Who makes those decisions, how they make them, with what objective? These are all crucial questions, not just for shareholder value, but for society at large. But instead of immediately looking to company law, I think our starting point when we're worried about these questions should be to analyse and, if necessary, fix the incentives of the decision makers. I think an understanding of incentive structures is essential to any serious discussion about corporate governance. Indeed, to any discussion about responsible investment, ESG, sustainability, or corporate purpose. And therefore, discussion of these incentives is where I begin in my book. Private equity firms invest in, that is, they buy shares in private companies. They have clear incentives. Indeed, up to a point, they have contractual duties to maximize the financial returns on the investments they make in these private companies. Their own investors include pension funds and insurance companies who are trying to meet the future needs of their retirees or their policyholders, and they usually demand that private equity deliver outsized returns for the benefit of those beneficiaries. Private equity firms are, in turn, highly sophisticated shareholders of private companies. We would certainly expect them to be well placed to assess the impact of both short-term industry dynamics and longer-term societal and regulatory trends on the value of the businesses they acquire. Indeed, we know that they work hard to do that. They are well-informed shareholders. They have an ability to exert influence. That, indeed, is their business model. So we, I think, ought to accept that private equity firms are focused on value creation in their businesses. Some are concerned, though, about short-termism in private equity. They wonder over what period does a private equity firm seek to maximize value. When a private equity fund buys a company, it's with a view to selling it, usually to a well-informed buyer in the foreseeable future, typically between 3 and 7 years from acquisition, sometimes longer. In order to realize the best financial return on that business, the private equity firm must have confidence that the business will be attractive to a buyer at that future time. It therefore has to anticipate the environment into which it will be selling in the future and to be ahead of the longer term trends that will determine the value of the business at that time. It must react early in its holding period to those trends if it is to maximize value for its investors in the future. So if ESG issues, if sustainability issues are relevant to the long-term value of the business, and most of them are, many of them are, because the regulatory environment is evolving, because stakeholder preferences are shifting, if they're relevant to long-term value, then we would certainly expect a private equity firm to be focused on them and to be reactive to them. Private equity-backed companies, as many of you will know, are characterized by small, well-informed boards of directors, meeting regularly. They're highly focused on the value drivers in the business. Yes, of course, those boards focus on short-term issues. They focus on cash flow, on budgetary controls, and they certainly roll their sleeves up when there's a crisis, as many businesses will know from their experiences last year. All businesses have to focus on short-term issues. Otherwise, of course, there will be no long-term for them. But these boards are highly motivated. They have powerful incentives to focus on longer-term value drivers in the business as well. They generally have a plan. They're determined to execute it and to respond quickly when the world changes. The private equity firm is a critical force on the board, will surely use its influence on strategic planning to steer the company in a direction that addresses challenges that are relevant to future value. So that means that far from there being any reason to suppose that private equity firms have a systematic incentive to focus on short-term value creation, given their objectives and their incentive structures, we would actually expect the opposite. They have built-in incentives to be interested in long-term value creation because they know that their well-informed buyer in 5 years' time will be thinking about the prospects for the business in the 5 or 10 years after that. And along with the management team who are similarly incentivized, we can expect private equity firms to pursue strategies and to design decision-making processes that create long-term shareholder value. And we would expect them to be good at it. Even on this measure, of course, private equity firms do not always get it right. We know that. Diversity, for example, is one area where private equity has significantly more work to do. Despite the evidence that diverse groups make better decisions, European private equity-backed companies are still not focused enough on diversity amongst decision makers. Recent research demonstrates that. However, sometimes, inevitably, there will also be negative externalities that are just inherent in the shareholder value strategy being pursued by a portfolio company. But what that means is that the more policymakers can force companies to internalize negative externalities, the more we would expect an effective long-term shareholder value strategy to work to minimize those negative externalities. It means that private equity-backed companies will respond quickly and effectively to policy interventions, whether that be imposing new liabilities for bribery and corruption, as we saw several years ago in the UK, or breaches of data security, or new carbon taxes, or whatever. So we'd expect private equity-backed companies to be highly responsive to changes in law or regulation that affect long-term value. But the principals in a private equity firm also have other incentives. And those other incentives sit alongside these incentives to generate that shareholder value. And one such incentive, which I talk about quite a lot in my book, arises from the fact that private equity is not actually private. As we know, private equity firms are publicly associated with what happens in an underlying business. They may even be liable for it. If a portfolio company behaves irresponsibly, it breaches a law or societal norms, the private equity firm will surely be associated with that behavior. If the breach is of competition law, for example, the private equity firm may even face significant financial liabilities that will effectively pierce the corporate veil. The firm, the private equity firm, therefore has an incentive to ensure that the business behaves responsibly, whether or not it is also in the company's own long-term financial interests to behave responsibly. In my book, I refer to this as a magnified incentive to respect law and to protect reputation. And this magnified incentive is particularly interesting to me because it increases as other financial market participants, particularly the institutions that typically invest in private equity funds, themselves prioritize responsible investment. That's because the accountability mechanism that is built into a private equity firm's relationship with its own investors is very direct. Of course, there will inevitably be some greenwashing. All firms, all organizations work hard to present their credentials in the best possible light. But as reporting becomes more sophisticated, more standardized, very much the theme of EU and UK interventions in non-financial reporting, and as investors employ more specialist resource to perform due diligence on investee funds, the scope to hide irresponsible or unethical behaviors will reduce, as will the willingness of investors to turn a blind eye to those behaviors. So the structure of the industry, which requires regular fundraising, facilitates detailed investor due diligence, bespoke negotiation of investment documentation, all of that makes it very hard for most private equity firms, even very successful ones, to ignore the evolving preferences of their own investor base. So one of the arguments that I make in my book, commonplace to many in private equity, but interestingly not so to many outside the industry, is that while we would expect all commercial companies to be responsive to changes that affect the long-term value of their business, there are good reasons to believe that private equity-backed businesses will be super responsive to those changes. And they have magnified incentives to care about societal norms and potential liabilities, even including those that don't actually affect the underlying value of the businesses they own. So as I say, much of that is fairly commonplace to people in the industry, much less so outside of it. And now I wanted to turn to some law reform proposals and think about those in the context of private equity, and particularly in the context of the incentives that I've just been talking about. So there are various law reform proposals around at the moment that would look to change the fiduciary duties of directors to be more stakeholder focused. And many of these proposals would affect private equity-backed companies as well as all other companies, including listed companies. My view is that these proposals could actually harm the cause of those who advocate them. To start with, my view is that UK company law already reinforces this focus on long-term value creation, although personally I doubt it's a strong driver of it. A duty to promote the success of the company, taking into account long-term consequences of decision-making on all stakeholders, which is essentially what UK company law already tells directors to do, that seems pretty sensible to me. Promotion of the success of the company, taking into account long-term consequences of decisions on all stakeholders. And the value of the system at the moment, in my view, is that to the extent that directors pay attention to their company law duty, it focuses their minds on balancing the interests of all stakeholders to achieve long-term value. And the directors are, at least in theory, accountable to shareholders for the achievement of that objective. So it has a built-in accountability mechanism, as well as a focus on long-term. Of course, many people criticize directorial behavior, and many who do that argue that they do not focus on long-term value, that they're short-term, they ignore stakeholder interests. Maybe that's true. I think it's much less true in private equity than it is in some other parts of the market, but nevertheless, if it's true, it's not the fault of company law. Perhaps we could tweak the law to make its emphasis on long-term value creation clearer, but it's hard to see that that would make much difference in practice. It seems unlikely to change the incentives that I think are the drivers of behavior. It seems to me that private equity-backed company directors are likely to be focused on long-term value because they're incentivized to do so, and the existing company law framework actually reinforces that focus. Giving further priority to stakeholder interests beyond what the law already requires only seems likely to me to contribute to the pressure on directors to make decisions focused on the short term, to the extent that it makes any difference at all. Corporate governance matters hugely, but it seems to me that it's dangerous to ask it to do more of the heavy lifting than it is capable of doing, especially because I believe there is real value in a system that gives decision makers a clear yardstick against which to measure their decisions. There is also value in an accountability mechanism that in a private company really does work. And I think that if we want to change the behavior of companies, we have no choice but to use other tried and tested and more reliable means. First, we need investors to understand that long-term value creation is in their financial interests. And then, to the extent that the pursuit of long-term shareholder value does give rise to negative externalities, which it will in various scenarios, we need policymakers to intervene. We need them to change the incentives that drive decision-making. So they need to ban or tax behaviors that damage the planet. They need to make them illegal or uneconomic. We need to protect employees and customers with specific legislation where there's a market failure. And these policy changes may be hard to achieve, but I think they're vital. And in my view, those advocating for reform of directors' duties are only giving lawmakers and regulators another excuse not to intervene more directly, not to focus on the changes that will actually affect, real-world behavior. But I should say that I am much more positive. I'm certainly much less skeptical about other recent developments in corporate governance in the UK, in particular developments in corporate reporting. I actually do think that reporting can drive changes in behavior, so long as the reporting is well defined and carries with it some clear legal or reputational consequence. Asking companies to report too much information is, of course, unhelpful, but asking them to measure and report on key metrics, for example, the extent to which they've undertaken due diligence on their supply chain or the extent of their greenhouse gas emissions, all of these things can have an effect on incentives and they can drive positive change. It can also help regulators and governments, of course, to identify negative externalities and to demand their attention and help calibrate their intervention. So today's announcements, for example, by the European Commission on significant enhancements to large private company reporting as regards sustainability, I mean, one will have to analyze the detail of those. And of course, poor regulation is often worse than no regulation at all. But assuming that they calibrate those reporting requirements well, I think they could be a very positive step forward for EU companies. In this regard, of course, that kind of reporting can also act on the magnified incentive of the private equity firm. If their own investors, their key stakeholder, is concerned about those issues, it makes it more apparent to investors, to outsiders, how these firms are behaving. And that's also why I'm quite drawn to the idea of corporate purpose. And I know we're going to come to this in the panel discussion, and I don't want to say too much, but it's my view that a successful company is likely to have a well-defined purpose, in quotations. According to the UK regulator, the FRC, purpose is why the company exists, what it does, and what it's seeking to achieve. A statement, in other words, against which its strategic decisions can be judged. If you like, it's how the company intends to create long-term sustainable value. It's not a substitute for long-term sustainable value creation. It's not a qualification to it. It's a statement of how the company is going to achieve that. At least that's how I understand the concept. But the question I think many of us ask is whether this concept of corporate purpose, important though it may be, and many are skeptical about it, but important though it may be, is it something that belongs in the world of management and strategy consulting, or does it belong in the world of the lawyer? And actually, my view is that changing directors' duties to reflect a purpose, at least on a mandatory basis, would be problematic and not fruitful. Happy to elaborate on why later if appropriate. I think it's true for all companies, but I think in a closely held company, it's particularly futile. But I think that requiring companies to articulate their purpose and report on how it's being achieved is a good discipline. And I think it could drive positive behavioral change. Again, I think it could affect incentives. It can focus the board's decision making. It might help to bind in stakeholders, might give rise to reputational costs for companies that take actions that are not clearly true to their long-term purpose. Indeed, we've seen the B Corporation, a form of business organization many of you will be familiar with, which does require companies to declare and report on their public benefit. That's gaining in popularity. Indeed, a number of private equity firms have themselves converted to B Corps. I think that's all very helpful, and I hope we can discuss that further in the panel discussion, because I'd really like to hear the other panelists' views and your views on these questions about corporate reporting and corporate purpose. I also, to add, it's probably implicit, but I wouldn't be opposed personally in principle to developing European Commission proposals on requirements for companies to undertake mandatory due diligence into environmental and human rights risks in their supply chain, and to take action where they discover them to mitigate or eliminate those problems. Again, asking companies to be aware of the harms they create, those that they cause or contribute to, and to remedy those harms seems like a reasonable thing for society to require. And I think changing the incentives of the decision makers through reporting and through positive duties to investigate is potentially helpful. I'll conclude there. I just conclude by saying that it seems to me that if policymakers do intervene to change incentives, we expect private equity-backed companies to respond. And I think that's partly because they have a very, very strong focus on corporate governance, on sound decision-making, on management accountability. And it's in part because the UK's existing legal framework permits and reinforces that focus on sound decision-making and long-term value creation. And I think this aspect of the private equity model should appeal to policymakers and regulators, but I think it should also stand the private equity industry in good stead to meet the considerable social value challenge that it faces. We know there are many skeptics about the model, and no doubt there are some practices which one could criticize, but the social value challenge, demonstrating your value to society and your impact on society, is going to be absolutely critical to all business organizations in the decade ahead. And I think that private equity firms are well equipped to adapt to that environment and to take on that challenge.